One of my very favorite speeches is the inaugural address of John F. Kennedy, which he delivered on January 20th, 1961. Kennedy wanted to lay out a positive vision of what America should be and inspire listeners, including those who didn't vote for him, to embrace and act upon this ideal. He did not want to bore people. He told his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, "I don't want people to think I'm a windbag." With that in mind, Sorensen helped Kennedy craft a short, pithy speech that packs a powerful punch. Kennedy talks about the Cold War and America's relationship with the Soviet Union, saying, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." He pledges support for the poor across the world, saying, "If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich." But the most famous passage, and the one that you might well know by heart, is his challenge to the country to take up the call of public service. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. It was freezing on the day of Kennedy's inauguration in the 20s, with 8 inches of snow on the ground in D.C. But people who braved the cold that day still talk about that speech as a pivotal moment in their lives, one that inspired them to public service. Kennedy was elected by a small popular vote margin, but after the speech, nearly 75% of Americans expressed approval of him. That's evidence that it was a pretty good speech. Kennedy's speech is a great example of our third and final Aristotelian concept of persuasion, logos. You'll recall that Aristotle's formula, which is really the gold standard in rhetoric, says that in order to be a persuasive speaker, you need 3 things. You need ethos, or credibility, which we explored in the first lecture of this series. You need pathos, or emotional engagement, which was the topic of our last lecture. And finally, you need logos, or clear logic. Logos means that you're persuading by offering up clear, substantive arguments. You're appealing to the mind in a satisfying way. And having good logos also means that when you're done speaking, people will remember your message. Your ideas sink in so that people will be able to mull over your ideas long after the speech is over. Kennedy's central message of service to the country is an example of what you're aiming for. The logos is clear. His message is straightforward, easy to follow, and above all, memorable. So how do you go about achieving logos? You have to have something meaningful to say, and you have to say it clearly. Let's start with thinking about how to find something meaningful to say, how to make your case. To figure that out, it can be helpful to understand the 2 basic ways people make arguments. Aristotle talked about this, and we still teach it in law school in legal writing classes. The first basic way to make an argument is to use deductive logic. In deductive logic, you arrive at the right outcome if you figure out the correct rule and apply it to the facts at hand. This is the foundation of basic legal reasoning. First-year law students are taught to write legal briefs using a formula abbreviated as IRAC, I-R-A-C, which stands for issue, rule, application, conclusion. The structure goes like this. You start by identifying the central issue of the case, then state the rule that governs this sort of dispute, apply that rule to the specific facts of the case, and from that, reach the correct conclusion. So, for example, perhaps your case involves a car accident. The issue is whether John, the driver, was driving recklessly. The rule that applies is a law that says that if you are driving more than 20 miles per hour over the speed limit, then you are driving recklessly. You apply that rule to the specific facts of the case. John was driving 55 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone, and from that, you reach your conclusion. John was driving recklessly. Aristotle explained this in the form of a syllogism, in which a major premise and a minor premise point the way to a conclusion. If A and B are true, then C must also be true. Here's a famous example. All men are mortal beings. That's the major premise, similar to the rule governing that legal case. Socrates is a man. That's the minor premise or the particular facts of the case. Therefore, Socrates is a mortal being. That's the conclusion, reached by applying the rule to the facts. It's crucial to make sure that your major premise or rule is true. If it isn't, then your conclusion will be flawed. Look at the reckless driving example again. Let's imagine that the law says that you're driving recklessly if you're driving more than 20 miles per hour over the speed limit, but it also includes an exception for emergency responders. And let's imagine that John is a firefighter who was driving a fire engine quickly to the scene of a fire with his lights blazing and siren blaring. If you determine that he was driving recklessly, you've reached the wrong conclusion because the major premise was wrong. The correct major premise would include that special exception for emergency responders. Your minor premise was also wrong because it left out the fact that John's a firefighter. But if you correct those errors, you now have, if you are driving more than 20 miles per hour over the speed limit, you are driving recklessly unless you are an emergency responder. John is an emergency responder, and therefore, your conclusion, John was not driving recklessly. That's the right outcome. So that's deductive reasoning. Aristotle also wrote about the power of inductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, instead of starting with a particular rule, you use certain specific observations to reach a conclusion. For example, maybe you want to argue that kids who go to preschool perform better throughout the rest of elementary school. The more facts you have and the more reliable they are, the more credible your claim. If you argue that preschool is good for kids because you went to preschool and look at you now, that's not as credible as a claim that's based on a study that includes hundreds of kids who went to preschool. You'll also want to think about how your population sample could be criticized and whether there are other variables that could be causing the correlation you're observing. For example, if you draw your population sample from a bunch of affluent kids, all of whom went to preschool and did well in elementary school, your argument is vulnerable to the counter-argument that they would have done well anyway because they're in a wealthy school district with resources, or because they've got support at home that makes it likelier they will succeed academically. These are the sorts of things lawyers think about when questioning expert witnesses. If the sample upon which an expert bases her opinion is flawed, then her opinion won't be credible. So, reach for deductive reasoning if you're making an argument in which you have a general rule or principle that you can apply to a specific set of circumstances, and use inductive reasoning if you have a bunch of specific instances from which you are generalizing to reach a conclusion. Understanding the kind of argument you are making can help you make your point as persuasively as possible. Another tip for achieving logos, you want to know very clearly what your main message is. You need to know the take-home point that you hope your audience will hear. We talked about this when discussing ethos and pathos, but it's important for logos as well. You need to have a central message, a theme. And that theme has to be something that you care about and that the audience will care about. You could think of this main message as the conclusion to whatever kind of argument you are making. but you don't have to save it for the concluding paragraph of the speech. You can weave that central message throughout the speech. But first, you have to find it. Here is a great exercise to find your message. Ask yourself to state the central message of your speech in a single sentence. What would that sentence be? I ask my law students to do this all the time. I recently asked one to tell me the central message of her closing argument for a case. And at first her answer was, well, this is a case about assault and the damages that were caused when the assault happened, and then also about liability because it's an assault on an airplane by an off-duty flight attendant against a passenger. And there's a question of whether both the off-duty flight attendant and the airline would be liable for what happened. Okay, that's a message, but it isn't catchy and it isn't as sharp as it could be. So we worked to distill that, to turn it into a theme. Ultimately, that explanation became, this is a case about an out-of-control flight attendant and the airline that allowed his behavior to happen. Much better. Your central message has to satisfy the requirements of ethos and pathos that we've discussed previously. It has to make meaning out of the data. It has to tell us why we should listen to you and why what you're saying matters. It has to engage us too. And the central message is also key to making your logos clear. If you know your central message, then you know where to start with that message. You know what to emphasize, that message, and you know where to end with that message. So let's say you figured out your central message, your theme, and you figured out the most logical way to make a case in support of it. Now you need to pay attention to structure. The more logical and straightforward your structure, the more likely it is that your audience will hear and process your message. As you craft your structure, it can be helpful to think about your audience's experience of the speech. What do they have to do in order to take something away from your speech to understand you? They have to listen and pay attention. All that information is coming to them primarily through their ears, and they have to be able to make sense of it. It has to be straightforward enough that they can process it. Clear structure is key to making your logos clear. If your structure is convoluted, it makes it a lot harder for the audience to follow. Now, I don't mean you have to dumb things down. A really good lecture can and should have meaningful content. But one of your jobs as a speaker is to make sure that the content is offered in the most straightforward, logical way possible, so that one thought follows another. That's again because of your audience's experience. If you were to communicate with your audience in writing instead of in a speech, and your logic wasn't as tight as it could be, your audience still has a chance of following you. That's because they get to control the pace at which they read your writing. They could reread the really complicated parts, or take notes, or even read things out of order if they have to. But with a speech, the audience doesn't have that option. They have to take things in the order in which you offer it and at the speed at which you deliver it. So you'll want to make sure you're using the right order and the right speed. Here are two great ways to test your structure to make sure it is as clear as possible. You can think of this as yet another draft of the speech. We talked in a previous lecture about how the first draft usually starts with the speaker's point of view, where you're just trying to capture everything you might want to say about the topic. And we talked about how in your second draft, you're going to look at the material again, but thinking about it from the audience's point of view, thinking about why they are even listening to you and what they hope to take away from the speech. In your third draft, you're going to focus on your structure. You could start by jotting down an outline of the speech. Use that old-fashioned outlining form, Roman numeral 1, ABC, Roman numeral 2, ABC. So, for example, here's how part of Kennedy's inaugural address looks in outline form. This comes from the middle part of the speech where he makes 6 promises, each aimed at different groups. Here are the first 2. Roman numeral 1, To old allies, we pledge the loyalty of faithful friends. A. United, there is little we cannot do. B. Divided, there is little we can do. Roman numeral 2. To newly free states, we pledge not to control you. A. We don't always expect you to agree with us. B. But we hope to find you strongly supporting your own freedom. You can see how sharp this is. He's making 6 different points, but each in the form of a promise. So it's catchy and easy to follow. Each promise is followed by 2 clarifying points, which gives the audience a little bit more time to process each promise, and also creates a sort of rhythm that makes this more memorable. And it's also very clear that when he introduces a new idea, he explores it in that same paragraph, and then he puts it down and picks up a new idea. He's not mixing the points up at all. When you take the text and put it in the form of an outline, you can see this great sharp structure, and that's part of what makes this speech very strong. Here's another way you can test the strength of your structure. Put your speech down and then try delivering it out loud without looking at your notes. Don't worry about whether you're getting the words exactly right, just paraphrase them, but try to get the order of the paragraphs right. Notice the places where you can't remember what comes next. When you hit a spot like that, then think to yourself, okay, what is the next thing that I would naturally say here? Then pick your script up again and see what would happen if you were to rearrange the text so that what you just thought of comes out next. The structure of your speech needs to be completely clear and logical to you. You need to know it in your bones. If you don't, if there's some point that you just keep forgetting again and again, it is a good sign that that's the wrong structure. I'll tell you my favorite structure. I try to figure out how to make my speech have 3 main points. That's because it's pretty easy to remember 3 points. If instead I have a speech that has 10 points, I know for sure I'm going to get jumbled and you're going to get bored. It feels much better to hear a speech that starts, I want to tell you about 3 things, rather than, I want to tell you about 10 things, right? So in this part of the drafting process, I'm typically looking for ways to group together my ideas under 3 headings. What I'm looking for is what these ideas have in common, so I can give the material some shape. For example, if I were to give you a speech about how to speak effectively, and if I were to try to do that in just one speech rather than in the 24 lectures I'm giving you during this course, my structure would probably be ethos, pathos, logos. That structure would allow me to talk to you about credibility, emotional engagement, writing, dealing with nerves, body language, all sorts of things, and all topics that we'll be getting to in this course, by the way. I would figure out how each thing that I want to say fits into that 3-point ethos, pathos, logos structure, and that would help me remember each point I want to cover and would also make the structure clearer to you. You can also use the teaching of modern-day psychologists to make your logos more clear. We know some things about how audiences' minds work. For example, we know that people tend to be single-path thinkers. It's hard to process 2 ideas at once. Much easier if you can take one idea at a time. So you'll want to make sure that when you take up an idea, you explore it fully and finish it before going on to the next idea. If instead you start with a thought and then interrupt it to add an additional thought and then go back to the first thought, you are asking a lot of your audience. You're asking them to pause in their understanding of that first thought and to keep it in their minds while they focus briefly on something else. And then by the time you're done with that digression, they may have forgotten the first thought, or they may have just tuned you out altogether. As I've mentioned previously, we also know that people have limited attention spans. I see this with my students, bright, able people, but they can't focus for hours at a stretch. No one can. Instead, many people can only listen for about 3 to 4 minutes at a time, and then the mind wanders. So it is smart to think about getting the audience's attention back. You could do this by telling a story, or introducing an interesting visual aid, or even just simply saying, we've finished with the first point, and now I'm moving on to the second. Even simple transitional language like that can wake people up again. Even with a tired audience, though, you know there are two moments when they are definitely paying attention. Audiences perk up and listen when you first start to talk, and they listen when it sounds like you are winding down. That moment when you first start to talk, that's called the moment of primacy. It's when you're making your first impression. The audience is getting oriented and deciding whether this speech is worth listening to or whether they'd rather check their messages on their phones. And they're not tired yet. They're all listening to the first few sentences. So take advantage of that moment. You'll want to spend some time thinking about a catchy way to start so that you are excited to deliver that opening. That can help with nerves so that you are projecting confidence, which helps with your ethos. If your opening is catchy and tells the audience how they're going to benefit from listening to your speech, then you're giving them a reason to care and starting to create that relationship with them, engaging them. That's pathos. And you will also want to begin the process of making your logical argument in the first paragraph of the speech by introducing the conclusion you plan to reach. Hit that theme from the very beginning. It's the first time they will hear it, and since they're listening, they will remember it. That's logos. We also know that audiences listen to the end of the speech. It's the very last thing you say to them, so whatever you say then is also likely to stick with them. This is called the moment of recency, another place to hit your theme. We remember best the last thing that we hear. So you'll want to circle back to the central message you introduced in your moment of primacy. Audiences are also likely to remember things if you say them more than once. This is the concept of frequency. There's an old adage of public speaking that says, you tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them that you told them. That's good advice because hearing something more than once helps people to process it. So that's why you're going to hit your theme in your opening, your conclusion, and also a couple of times in the middle as well. So, for example, that student of mine who was arguing about an assault on an airplane, she started with, this is a case about an out-of-control flight attendant and the airline that made his behavior possible. That's her moment of primacy, and it's the first time she's introducing her theme. She could then use it to make the structure of the speech clear. She could say, let's start with that flight attendant, and then go on to explain what he did that made him out of control as compared to what he was supposed to do. Then she could transition by saying, and how did this come to be? The airline made it possible. So she's using her theme again. And then her moment of recency could hit the theme one more time, this time rolling the jury into the action. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this flight attendant was out of control, and this airline let him get away with it time and again. But you have the power to stop them both. Hold them accountable. Not only does it help the audience to hear things more than once, it also helps them if you take the time to explain your ideas, especially if they're complicated ones. So you'll want to be sure you are not racing through the thought. Slow it down so people can get it. A great way to do this is to tell a story that illustrates what you're talking about. For example, let's imagine that you are trying to explain something complex, like a banking regulation. If you can tell the story of how things were going wrong before this regulation existed and how things are going right now for real people in the real world because of the regulation, then we're likely to listen. Plus, we'll be more receptive if, after that, you need to delve into the text of the regulation itself. By telling us the story, you spent the right amount of time on the idea to help us start to master it. Then when you go through it again, by taking us through the text, we'll be better able to follow you and remember your points. What else are audiences likely to remember? Anything that's really vivid, that pops. For example, some of you may remember the trial of O.J. Simpson. Simpson was a famous football player who was accused of murdering his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. O.J. was represented by Johnny Cochran and other accomplished lawyers who became known as the Dream Team. That's how good they were. One of the pieces of evidence that the state introduced was a pair of blood-soaked gloves that had likely been used in the commission of the crime. And in a bit of misguided courtroom theatrics, a prosecutor had O.J. try on the bloody gloves. And guess what? They were too small. It was a vivid moment that would definitely stick in the minds of the jury. So Johnny Cochran took that vivid moment and turned it into one of the themes of his closing argument. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. You can make things vivid by using props or visual aids, like those bloody gloves. You can do it by telling a story. You can do it by painting a picture with your words, by describing a scene with vivid detail. You could do it with catchy language, as Kennedy did in his inaugural address. My 6th grade English teacher had a poster on her classroom wall with the "ask not" quote on it as an example of chiasmus. Chiasmus is a rhetorical device where you present a concept together with its mirror image, like when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Kennedy turns the whine, "what have you done for me lately?" on its head. And that mirror image is memorable and inspiring. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. He is succeeding in getting his main idea to stick with you. Getting that thought into your head makes the logos more clear. I've got a couple of rules for legal argument that can be helpful to you in any speech in making your logic clear. The first is the rule of restraint. This rule says that in order to persuade, you should figure out the narrowest set of propositions that must be established to prove a point, argue the heck out of those propositions, and then stop. For example, in that case of the off-duty flight attendant who assaulted an unruly passenger, my student wanted to argue that the case reflected the death of the customer service industry. That's a pretty big claim to make. The law doesn't require her to persuade the jury that there is no good customer service anywhere anymore, but she took that battle on by making it the theme of the argument. The problem is that you might have a jury member who would listen to the speech and think, well, now, I can think of times in my life recently when I've seen great customer service, so I don't think she's right. And if an audience member rejects a major theme of your speech, then he might decide he doesn't believe anything you're saying. So this student wrote another draft of the closing, and this time she argued more narrowly, focusing only on what she had to prove, that this particular flight attendant and this particular airline had behaved improperly. It was easier for her to make her case because her argument was more defensible, so the logic was better. Here's another rule of legal argument that can be helpful, the rule of preemption. This rule says that you must deal fairly with the best arguments against your positions. If you are trying to persuade your audience about something, but there are good arguments on the other side, then you are better off acknowledging those arguments and dealing with them rather than ignoring them. For example, let's return to that speech we imagined about the value of early childhood education. Your listeners may be thinking about the costs involved and the fact that there are limited funds available. That is a valid concern. And if the audience is thinking about it and you don't address it, then you won't persuade them. Sometimes people give speeches but really don't want to permit a question and answer session afterwards because they don't want to have to deal with the hard questions on the other side. But if you duck the questions, then you won't succeed in making your case. It is better to anticipate the questions if you can, and then give some thought about how to address them in a satisfactory way. This leads me to the final thing I want to tell you about logos. It is really important to get the facts right. Audiences instinctively can tell when you haven't mastered the facts or when you are lying. And if there's anyone in the audience who knows enough about the topic to know for sure that you've gotten the facts wrong, then you're sunk. We talked about this in our first lecture about ethos. Aristotle said, men have a sufficient natural instinct for what is true. Things that are true and things that are better are, by their nature, practically always easier to prove and easier to believe in. We'll talk more in a later lecture about the importance of telling the truth. But for now, think of it like this. If the audience suspects you are uninformed, or that you are exaggerating or lying, it will distrust your entire argument. So in these first 3 lectures, you've gotten a grounding in classical rhetoric, which is going to help you write a better speech. You want to achieve ethos, or credibility, pathos, or emotional engagement, and logos, or clear logic. In our next lecture, we're going to go deeper into logic by exploring logical fallacies and how to avoid them.